Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. I know my camera's a little off again. I'm really sorry about that. But I am Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of members of our leadership team, which aside from me is former Congressman Mel Levine and former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. We thank tonight's special guest, Secretary Janet Napolitano, and our moderator, Pat Morrison, for agreeing to be with us tonight to discuss the safety of our homeland and all kinds of related issues in these very tumultuous times. In the coming weeks, we have a great lineup of speakers. Next week on May 22nd, we look forward to an hour with the former acting U.S. Solicitor General, Neil Katyal, to update us on all things related to the Trump lawsuits. Neil Katyal, as most of you already know, is a keen court watcher, a political analyst, a very smart lawyer, and a person who has argued a record-breaking 51 cases before the United States Supreme Court. As always, an hour with Neil Katyal will be full of information, insights, and great analysis. We hope you'll register if you haven't already done so. The link will be sent in the email you get right after tonight's program. In the following week, on the 29th, we will present journalist and author Jacob Heilbrunn to discuss the right's centuries-long romance with foreign dictators, to be followed in early June with another UC Berkeley superstar School of Law dean, Erwin Chemerinsky, who will talk about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism on college campuses, part 2. You remember we had him about 2 months ago, and he's going to continue his conversation with us. A couple of really quick housekeeping notes. All of our programs are recorded and appear on our JewsUnitedForDemocracy.org website. Just click the past events tab and you will find, starting with the most recent, all 210 or so of our past programs. There's also a search function, so all you have to do is type in the speaker you're looking for and it will come right up there, so that it's very easy to use. You can also go to our YouTube channel, which is America at a Crossroads, and find any of our past programs there. Everyone who is here now has clearly received the join webinar link from Zoom, but if you find that the program is approaching and you don't have a link, just go to any recent email, re-register for the program that you want to attend, and if it's happening within the hour, you'll get a very easy join webinar now link. So it's a very easy way to remember in case you're in crisis and I don't respond to your email, which I hope I do, and I try to, but sometimes it's a little hectic right before a program starts. So I just wanted to give you that tip. Now to introduce tonight's guest, please welcome my colleague and friend, a vital member of our leadership team, former Congressman Mel Levine. Mel?
Thanks very much, Janice. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce somebody who has been kind of a lifelong public servant and who's done that with extraordinary talent and dignity. By any measure, Janet Napolitano has had an extraordinary career. Among the many significant positions she has held, she has served successfully as Attorney General and then Governor of her home state of Arizona, and Secretary of Health and Human Services under President Obama. Most important to me was her service as president of the University of California, where she was a hugely effective leader on behalf of the university, utilizing both her academic and political skills. I believe citizens of California owe Janet an incredible debate for the leadership that she showed as the president of the University of California. She's still at Cal. She's a faculty member of the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley, which has become now, if not the finest public policy school in the country. Actually, I think it is the finest public policy school in the country. And I say that as someone who went to the Princeton Public Policy School when it had a name that it had to remove. In any event, we're delighted to have Janet back with us. She will be interviewed by another highly accomplished woman, Patt Morrison, who is a longtime acclaimed writer for the LA Times, as well as a much awarded broadcast journalist on KCET TV and on KPCC. Her 6 Emmys and 6 Golden Mike Awards are emblematic of her skills. And it's a pleasure for me to turn the program over to Pat.
Mel, thank you very much. And thank you to all of us who are joining us, all of you who are joining us this evening. If you have a question for Secretary Napolitano, we're going to be getting to those later in the hour. You can write it in the Q&A box and we'll have it sorted out and try to get to your question before we wrap up later this evening. But Secretary Napolitano, thank you for being here. I echo everyone else's sentiments.
Thank you, Pat. Look forward to the conversation.
The phrase that has been thrown around for decades in American politics, and this year is no exception, is border crisis. So I will ask you, from your position, earlier position as Homeland Security Secretary, is there a border crisis, and how is it different from what we keep hearing about as the border crisis?
Right. So I speak not only as the former Secretary of Homeland Security, but a former border state governor from Arizona and a former federal prosecutor before then in Arizona. I've dealt with that border for years. And I would say, if you want to use the word crisis, use the word crisis. And that is driven solely by numbers. The numbers arriving at our southwest border have risen dramatically and rose dramatically until about January of this year. And now they're starting to go down again. And the reason, I think the chief reason, is that the country of Mexico is being much more active in terms of intercepting people trying to immigrate unlawfully to the United States. But, the border, it's 1,940 miles. It's different geographies. It's rivers, it's streams, it's desert, it's mountains. It's a very, very tough crossing. One of the big changes that I've seen is in the composition of who is trying to cross into the United States. When I was governor and secretary, the dominant cohort were Mexican males, and they were coming to the United States to find work. And then there were always some that were involved in the drug trade and in human trafficking. And there are still some involved in the drug trade and human trafficking. But setting aside those, the very large majority were economic migrants for all intents and purposes. Now you have migrants from throughout South America. You have migrants from the Northern Triangle of Central America. You have migrants from Africa, from Cuba, from Haiti. Even last year, there were 30,000 that were picked up who were immigrants from China, who had gotten to South America and made the tortuous walk up to or trip up to the southwest border. And also a difference in composition is they're no longer mostly single males, many, many more families and families with children. And of course, that makes the whole management of the border much more complicated and difficult from any number of humanitarian purposes. So it's changed, but the numbers have been at times overwhelming.
For many years, successive administrations have been trying to get Mexico to do just what you described, to intercept people before they got to the US-Mexico border. And there is more of this, what's called internal deportation, as Mexico sends people back within Mexico to where they came from. Why is it in Mexico's interest to do this, given that historically the migration of people to the north has been a kind of release valve and a great source of money for Mexico?
Well, I think a couple of things. One is I think part of this is a product of diplomatic efforts between the Biden administration and the Lopez Obrador administration. We don't know all that's gone on in the back channels, but I think there's probably some give and go there. But the fact of the matter is that Mexico's efforts have greatly increased, and we can see that in the numbers that are getting to the southwest border. Now, there's still a lot of people getting to the southwest border. This is not a 100% fail-safe. And so we need to think about what does it take to have what I call order at the border. The United States, we're a sovereign nation. We're entitled to know who's coming in. We have legal pathways. And so one of the things the Biden administration has done is enlarged to some degree those legal pathways. To really fix that, you need Congress to act. And we can talk about that in a minute if you want. But using executive power, they've done what they can there. But then you have the number of immigrants who are crossing between the ports of entry. And there you need a combination of things. You need manpower, you need technology. In some places you do need physical infrastructure, and you need air cover. And all of those were greatly increased during the Obama administration. I think the Trump administration basically focused on building the wall, and they got some sections built. And the Biden administration has been asking Congress for years to increase the funding to be able to sustain order at the border. And it's only in the last budget that was passed a few weeks ago that they got some additional funding for that.
It's curious that you hear so many calls for shutting down the border altogether without reckoning with the economic consequences. I think during the 90s, there was a shortage of migrant workers because of a border shutdown that affected what farmers could and could not harvest throughout California, the Pacific Northwest, and the Midwest.
Yeah, and recognize, Mexico is the #1 trading partner of the United States. There are literally billions of dollars of trade that go back and forth between our two countries. And there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of jobs in the United States that are dependent on that trade. And so the notion that you're just going to close down the border, first of all, logistically, I think it's virtually impossible to close down that entire almost 2,000-mile border. But secondly, Pat, as you correctly note, the economic consequences would be severe and would be felt in the United States.
Two of the concerns of people who talk about shutting the border are, first of all, fentanyl, the quantities of drugs that are coming from Mexico to the north. In California, the National Guard at the border had a counter drug operation that seized over 1 million fentanyl pills over the course of a month, including at points of entry, not just between those controlled entries. That's one of the concerns. And the other, given that the diverse population of people crossing the border is raising questions about terrorism coming in on foot into the United States.
So I think the fentanyl crisis is a real crisis. I think over 100,000 Americans died from fentanyl last year alone. It's an epidemic. It's totally changing the criminal situation in many of our cities and even rural areas. And it's such an potent and immediately addictive substance that it's a real problem. And, most of the fentanyl that gets into the United States comes not between the ports of entry, but it's secreted in vehicles that somehow make it through the ports of entry. The federal government picks up a lot of it, but they by no means can pick it all up. So what needs to happen? A couple of things. One is, again, we need to work with our Mexican neighbors for them to do more to shut down some of these big narco operations, these narco cartels, which have plagued us for decades, and they've grown extraordinarily powerful in Mexico. Secondly, China has a big role to play here. China creates all the precursor chemicals that go into making fentanyl. I was reading an article just the other day that said that in China, the manufacturers of the chemicals that go into fentanyl actually don't have to pay value-added tax. They get a tax break on that manufacture. Well, let's see if we can work with the Chinese to shut that down. Now, when Biden and President Xi met at APEC last fall, fentanyl and shutting down some of these issues about fentanyl was one of the things they agreed on. What we haven't seen is any real action on the Chinese side.
We also see, you as a former border governor know this, action by Texas, for example, trying to stop, to enforce its own immigration laws at the border, saying the criminals are coming across. And of course, a federal court said they couldn't do that, but they've been doing it anyway. And you have states like Texas, which are doing internal deportations of migrants, sending them to California, sending them to New England. It seems like a lot of governors now have the bit between their teeth when it comes to trying to overstep their authority because they're frustrated at the fact that things are not getting done at the border the way they'd like to see them done.
Yeah, I think now we have politics raising its ugly head too. Look, as I say, we need and are entitled to order at the border, no question about that. But the border is a federal responsibility and immigration is a federal responsibility. The law has been clear on that for decades. And what happens if Texas does one thing and operates one system because under their state law, if it's allowed to stand, they can actually deport people to other countries. If they have one system and then Iowa has yet another system and then Florida has yet another system, it quickly breaks down in the sense of any kind of uniformity, and that affects our foreign policy and our international relations. This is one area where the federal government has the responsibility. It needs to carry out that responsibility. And I must say that Congress has a role. Congress is an important part of the federal government. And one of the most disappointing things I saw this past spring was when the Senate passed a bipartisan border bill as part of a Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan package. But it literally was 95% a Republican bill. President Biden basically gave them, their whole wish list, but for one or two things that, in a way, were not all that substantial, but that he couldn't agree to. And then former President Trump got involved and told the House, don't vote for that bill. Why? Well, again, politics raises its head. Immigration is a very potent issue for him this fall, and he didn't want any kind of a solution that came through Congress while he can actively campaign on it. So, again, immigration politically can be and is to some degree a third rail, and it's going to take men and women of goodwill and good faith to get around the table and really hammer out some of these issues like worker visas, like legal pathways to immigration, like what is really needed to staff the border, like how do we better deal with families with children who we find claiming asylum? How do we reform the asylum system altogether? Those are all big needs under the umbrella of immigration. And they all permit of, I believe, reasonable compromise and reasonable solutions. But right now, we're finding reasonable compromise hard to discover in our nation's capital.
It's wrong to talk about our immigration policy as a singular because it's been cobbled together over more than 100 years. Is it possible to dismantle the whole thing and start from scratch, or do we have to approach it like changing a tire on a moving car?
One would think how great it would be to start with a whiteboard and just, start from scratch and say, well, what role does immigration play? It plays an economic role, a labor role. It plays a humanitarian role. It plays an international relations role, and design an immigration system that meets our needs now, but also for the future. But I have to say, Pat, now we have to deal with the world of the real, and I think that is not likely to happen in our lifetimes. And so what we need to do is identify the particular issues that confuse, make more difficult than they ought to be, constipate, as it were, our immigration system, and figure out a pathway through each of those. And I was always a big supporter of a comprehensive immigration reform bill, a big umbrella type bill, but I've come to believe that in this era, we might have more success if we broke immigration into some subsets and moved individual bills.
As Secretary of Homeland Security, you were running a very diverse department that was also a very new department. So in a way, it was defining itself as it was created in the wake of the attacks of 9/11. The questions about terrorism tend to look to external terrorism, people coming into this country, planning acts of terrorism. But one thing you brought up during your administration was the concerns about domestic terrorists. We think of the bombing of the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City that killed more than 180 people, many of them children. And instituted a study to look at the potential and the risks of that kind. And I think a lot of people would argue with some success that since then, the internal risks of domestic right-wing extremist terrorism have only grown. Can you assess that for us?
Pat, I think that's absolutely correct. The risks of domestic extremism and domestic terrorism have grown exponentially, even in the years since I was the Secretary of Homeland Security. And part of that is sociologic, but I think part of it is the rise in social media and the increase in disinformation, misinformation that allows individuals, disaffected individuals who, before were kind of isolated and maybe there was one or two or whatever. All of a sudden they feel like they're part of a group, and all of a sudden the groups start acting and plotting. And I think we saw some manifestation of that by some of the groups that were involved in January 6th. I think it is actually rather remarkable that we haven't had more domestic terrorist incidents within the United States since then. But I know that for DHS and for the FBI and for the whole national law enforcement community, that this is a huge, huge concern.
And yet you would think that after January 6th, there would have been a come to Jesus sort of scared straight episode for Congress that would say, yes, indeed, we need to study this and take it seriously. And yet efforts to do that have been consistently resisted in Congress.
Well, again, politics raises its ugly head. And, we live in a very hyper-partisan era. You're either a Democrat or a Republican, and there the twain should meet. And if you're a Republican, you're either a Trump Republican or a non-Trump Republican. And in the Congress now, particularly in the House, we have a huge number of Trump Republicans, and they viewed January 6th very differently than what we actually saw happen with our eyes, and what's actually been litigated in the courts. But whenever you raise this issue now, you have to anticipate that you will quickly get enmeshed in all of the Trump stuff about witch hunts and, unnecessary censorship, et cetera, et cetera.
If not January 6th, what would it take to get members of Congress, to get political leaders to say this is a problem and we have to get it in hand?
Well, too often we act best when something really bad happens. Oklahoma City happened. Actually worked on that case when I was the U.S. Attorney in Arizona, and all of a sudden we had a lot more federal law enforcement resources devoted to the issue of domestic terrorism. That was what Tim McVeigh's ideology was, the bomber. After 9/11, all of a sudden we figured out, Al-Qaeda really is a problem. That was kind of known in the security community in Washington, D.C. and so forth, but it hadn't really pierced the American populace until we saw those horrible attacks on 9/11. And that changed everything. I mean, it created the Department of Homeland Security, where I was the third secretary. It changed the way we fly on airplanes. It changed how we work as citizens. See something, say something. It really, I would actually say this century is the post 9/11 century, and we're still dealing with the outfall of that. And now, of course, we see, and as I said earlier, I think propelled in part by the rapid growth in social media, the rise in domestic extremism and domestic terrorism. And I think that, you hate to rack and stack these things because you never know for sure what is going to happen. But in terms of risk, I would actually say that the risk of a domestic extremist mass attack is as high or higher than one that originates internationally.
Would you say that we are even remotely prepared for that?
I think in terms of a response and recovery, we're much better prepared than we were at 9/11. In terms of prediction and prevention, it's really tough because, for example, the intelligence community, and by that I mean the CIA and the NSA and so forth, when they're working internationally, the U.S. Constitution, by and large, doesn't apply, and they have, more surveillance type freedoms and capacities. But once you're in the United States and the U.S. Constitution comes into play, there are way more limits placed on that. And in terms of what the FBI can do, what the DHS can do domestically, what local law enforcement can do domestically. So you really have to think through what environment you're dealing with, and then what can you do lawfully and constitutionally within the United States.
You, of course, were the head of the UC system, I think the biggest public university system in the United States, if not the Western world. And a lot of people are asking, and certainly I wanted to know about your take on some of the campus protests going on. Right now, we have learned a couple of hours ago about some violent protests, as they're being called, at UC Irvine, where students have surrounded a science building, and police carrying some pretty heavy tactical gear have been sent to keep this from getting out of hand. But universities of California have a long history of protests, some of it peaceful, some of it less so. So from the position that you had and where you are now, still in the UC system, how do you see what has been happening, why, and how good the response has been?
Well, I think, first of all, let's start with the basics, which is that part of the responsibility of a university is the protection of the safety and security of students, faculty, and staff. Part of the responsibility of the university is the protection of free speech, and university campuses across the United States historically have been hotbeds of protest and free speech, not just in California, but throughout the country. So so a certain amount of protest activity, is part and parcel of a university culture, particularly the University of California writ large. Now let's turn to the current problem. The current problem is really difficult. Because now you've got it enmeshed in the conflict between Israel and Hamas. And now you've got students who have been infiltrated many times by outside agitators who take a particular view of that. And that view has, in many instances, unfortunately, expanded into actual anti-Semitism. And every university is entitled, even in a free speech environment, to have time, place, and manner restrictions. And public universities in particular have an obligation to provide an environment that's free of speech that is so pervasive that it interrupts a student's ability to be in a safe, non-discriminatory atmosphere.
And that's what we've been seeing.
And some places, that's what we've been seeing. Now, the individual decisions, college to college, campus to campus, how to handle that really depends on the individual circumstances. We saw what happened, for example, at Columbia University not too long ago. By way of contrast, UC Berkeley, where I'm now on the faculty, the protesters have made a lot of noise. They disrupted some of the commencements, didn't stop them, but they were chanting during some of the commencement exercises and so forth. But the leadership of the university has now worked out a pretty mellow, I would, if I can use that word, an agreement with the student protesters who were camped in front of Sproul Hall. And they're now leaving, and police were never called on any of the demonstrations. Contrast that with UCLA, and now I gather UC Irvine, and UC San Diego also had an episode. And each of those incidents is different. Each requires judgment as to whether and when police should be used, how should police be used, are the police properly trained in de-escalatory tactics? And then what consequences should be meted out to the students? Because I think it's fine to be a civil disobedient, but part of civil disobedience is consequences.
I think the protests were more widespread during the Vietnam War. It may be social media that amplifies the ones we're seeing now, but also in 1970, May of 70, we had students shot at Kent State, students shot and killed at Jackson State. And the course of American politics was altered in part because of what was happening on college campuses. In the 1980s, we had the anti-apartheid protests, which resulted in a lot of universities divesting from South Africa. And now there are demands as well from students protesting on campuses that the UC system, that other colleges and universities divest any investments from Israel. What is your take on that?
I say that's a no-go. First of all, I think South Africa was a unique and very specific situation, and frankly, the economies and the investments of U.S. institutions were not greatly involved in South Africa. So divestment was not a difficult thing to achieve. In contrast, many U.S. companies have facilities and employees in Israel. I think Intel, for example, which is a California headquartered company, I think is maybe the largest private employer in Israel. Beyond that, and here's what I always kept in mind, because when I was president of the UC, we would get asked to divest here and divest there. It says, once you start down that path, every time there's an issue, every time there's a controversy or a conflict, you face an argument to divest. Really, the funds that the University of California manages, and it's, I think, probably close to 140 billion now, represents the pension plans of the employees, the faculty and staff of the university. The fiduciary duty of those investments is to reap a return. And so I just think divestment is not the way to go. And besides, you have to think about what is it you're trying to achieve? Are you trying to isolate Israel? Do you think that by divesting, you're going to change the behavior of President Netanyahu and so forth? I think that's not likely. So it's really a symbolic divestment. And I think in that instance, in this instance, it just doesn't work.
I mentioned that the protests against Vietnam, the Vietnam War, did help to change the course of American politics. We're 6 months out from the presidential election. Do you think these protests and how students regard what's happening will do the same in this year of 2024?
Well, I think we need to be careful here. I don't think it will change whether young people vote for Biden versus Trump per se, but it may change and depress in some areas the willingness of young people to vote at all. And that would be unfortunate. But we'll have to see. Vietnam was very different. There was a draft, and students were all united in the anti-war. The difference here is you have students versus students, and there's no kind of agreement there about what the student point of view is. And I found it interesting. There's been some recent polling done out of Harvard, I believe, where they asked young people to rank what are the top issues for you in the fall campaign, and Israel Gaza came in like number 14 or 15. I mean, the economy was number 1, and housing was up there, immigration was up there, but Israel Gaza didn't crack the top 10.
We can weave in some questions from our listeners. Cynthia wonders how you think non-student protesters on college campuses should be dealt with. Are they protected? Do they have a right to be on campus?
Right. So there's a difference here between public universities and private. So private institutions have the right to cordon themselves off and only allow people on their grounds that are allowed to be there. Public universities, in a way, are public spaces. There are greater limits on what public universities can do. But in my view, to the extent there are outside infiltrators who are agitating and provoking violence, etc. To me, that's a legitimate use of the arrest power.
And Frank wonders whether you were aware that Berkeley Jewish students were blocked from entering campus through the main gate, or that an Israeli speaker was shouted down and had to be taken out a back door.
Yeah, my understanding is they were never totally blocked from entering the Sather Gate, is what it's called. And they had other ways of getting on campus. That got cleared up. And yes, there was a very unfortunate incident at Zellerbach Hall with an Israeli speaker who had to actually be evacuated from the stage. And I think some bricks were thrown and some windows were broken. But there again, university police intervened, stopped that, and I'm not familiar with and don't know what consequences have been meted out.
If you have questions for Secretary Napolitano, you can put them in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to all of them during the rest of this hour that remains to us. Back to the border question, Jeff wants to know about the assertion the national crime rate is higher because of crimes committed by people who enter this country illegally. And occasionally you see a high-profile murder or an assault that is committed by someone in this country illegally. And that episode is used as a larger example of crime attributable to people here illegally.
Yeah, that's the problem with making public policy by one story or one anecdote. There have been some serious crimes committed by those illegally in the country, but the data is overwhelming and clear that those who are immigrants in the country actually commit crimes at a lower rate than native-born Americans. And that applies to all kinds of crime, violent crime, property crime, you name it. And when you step back and think about it, it kind of makes sense. Particularly if you're in the country illegally or you're undocumented, last thing you want to do is draw any attention to yourself because the risk of deportation. That stereotype is really hard to combat because of people's underlying suspicions about immigrants.
Well, and you as a creature who has been in the world of politics know how powerful an anecdote is compared to statistics.
Yep, unfortunately, that is so. Don't confuse me with the data, right? I can tell a good story. And again, there have been some tragic stories. The murder of the young student in Georgia this past one. It's a terrible story. But more murders are committed by native-born Americans than by immigrants. More armed robberies are committed by native-born Americans than immigrants. And I'm talking not just individual cases, but as a rate, right? The rates are lower. So again, a difficult story to tell, but that's the fact of the matter.
You've been very involved with the DACA student program and trying to help those students get a foothold as some of the legal challenges have worked their way through the system. The last I read is that a judge in Texas versus United States ruled that DACA is illegal in spite of the Biden administration's rulemaking effort, but allowing renewals to continue for the time being. What's the status of the DACA program, and how could you present a case for why it's something the United States should embrace?
So we did DACA when I was secretary. In fact, the program was created by a memorandum that I issued to the Department of Homeland Security that was then announced by President Obama in the Rose Garden. So we were there at the creation of DACA, the institution of DACA, the implementation of DACA. And we did it because I had seen these young people. They were then known as dreamers. They don't call themselves that now, but they were known as dreamers. Young people brought to the United States as young children, really knew only the United States as home, but always had to look over their shoulder out of fear of deportation, and also couldn't work. And so if they were working, it was getting paid under the table with all the problems that presents. And it seemed to me that at the very least, these young people shouldn't have to worry that the weight of the US federal government is going to swoop down on them and put them into deportation proceedings. And so we created DACA to deal with this particular population. And when we started it, We didn't know if we'd have 500 or 5,000 or whatever. At its peak, DACA had, I think, 850,000 young people in it, including a number at the University of California who are students who now can get work authorization and so forth. At the time, we really didn't get that much pushback to it. I think Americans, at base are pretty fair people, and they understood that these young people were not being treated by the law fairly. And so we did DACA. DACA does not give a path to citizenship. Only Congress can do that, but it does allow people to live peacefully and safely in their communities. And again, that important work authorization. Now it's had a tortuous path. The Trump administration tried to rescind it. As president of the University of California, we sued the Trump administration to rescind that rescission. And that case went all the way to the US Supreme Court, and we prevailed. So DACA remained. But it remained in a situation where students or young people that were already enrolled could re-enroll, but that new applicants were no longer accepted. So that situation, to me, when I was talking earlier about breaking immigration into segments, that to me should be one of the top segments. Why? Because I believe it has bipartisan support.
A couple of other questions. Tom wonders what your thinking is about the state of civics education in the United States. He said the controversy over Gaza raises the question, are we teaching high school and college students what they need to know about how their government works so they can be good citizens in a democracy? This is something that was close to Sandra Day O'Connor's heart as well.
Oh, for sure. When Justice O'Connor retired from the Supreme Court, she started a whole national program on civics education. I must say, I think we do a lousy job. I think we do a lousy job at the high school level. I think our college students, by and large, they only learn it if they opt to take it. They don't have to take it. And the end result is we have young people who are not empowered. They're not empowered to fully understand the country that they are living in, the country that they will inherit. Their responsibilities as citizens of our country, and actually how to understand what they see on TikTok, on YouTube, on whatever social media platform they're watching, and how to be able to better discern what makes sense and what simply doesn't, and what's inconsistent with the way our government is organized.
Holly wants to know your position on professors who are taking up sides with or against the protesters in the Israeli-Hamas protests.
Well, I think, look, they're entitled to free speech rights too. And they're entitled to be out there. One would hope, now I'm being idealistic, that they would use this as a teachable moment. Teaching about the history of the conflict in the Middle East, teaching about what the issues really are underlying the current manifestation of that, teaching about what makes effective protest versus what is merely performative. And I believe that most of the protests to date in this instance have been merely performative, not really effective in the sense of affecting change. But professors have voices too, and they're entitled to have their voices be heard.
You mentioned young people in TikTok, and there is now the effort to force TikTok to be onshore, to be in domestic and American hands as a national security threat. When we think of Homeland Security in the old iteration, it was terrorists, it was people attacking with planes. But what about cybersecurity as a national security issue? How seriously is this being taken? What kind of measures are being taken?
Sure. So when I started as secretary in 2009, our number one threat that we were still dealing with were threats to aviation, in part because I think some of the international terrorists still saw 9/11 in a way as kind of a gold standard, as it were, in terms of a successful terrorist attack from their point of view. But as I went through my years as secretary, by the time I ended up 4 years later, almost 5 years later, issues about cyber and the protection of our nation's critical infrastructure, particularly from cyber attacks, was taking 40 to 50% of my time, growing problem. And it hasn't gone away. In fact, it's probably only multiplied. Now, the department now is reorganized. It has it's a division called CISA, which deals with the protection of the cyber that involves our critical infrastructure, things like power, things like water, things like 9/11 systems, things like our healthcare system, banking, all of those things that we all rely on in everyday life comprise what's called critical infrastructure. And the number and multiplicity and severity of cyber attacks there has only grown. Now, much of that is done by foreign state adversaries. So we know, for example, Russia is very active in the US cyberspace. We know China is active. We know Iran is active. But there's also lots of non-state actors that are messing around in there too. And so one of the things that Congress considered was whether, if you are part of a critical infrastructure sector, whether you would have certain cybersecurity mandates that you had to satisfy. They opted against the mandates and instead opted for a voluntary standard. Those standards have been pronounced by an agency called NIST, and lots of acronyms here, sorry about that. But yet again, I think this is a major issue from a homeland security standpoint. And now, of course, we have AI, and AI, which is a really interesting and in a way will be revolutionary technological development, is evolving so fast. But with all of its advantages and opportunities that it presents, there are some areas where it presents real security risks. And I think we're only beginning to delve into that.
As far as these critical infrastructure companies and businesses who are only required to observe voluntary protections, does any of them come up to snuff?
Oh, I'm sure some of them, I haven't gone company by company, whatever some of them do. I have a feeling that the insurance industry plays a role here because they want their insureds not to incur great losses because of a big cybersecurity incident. So I think that's a dynamic that if I were still secretary, I'd want to understand more.
We have a question from Anne and others. You'd mentioned, Madam Secretary, that you'd break down immigration into a number of separate bills and initiatives. Can you explain further about that, where they would break and what solutions would take what priorities?
Well, it would be enormously complicated. I mean, that's the beauty of doing one comprehensive bill. You get it all done in one fell swoop. But for example, you could see a bill that deals with legal migration, and that's labor focused. And how do we increase and improve the visa process? How do we enlarge the number of individuals allowed to come into the country lawfully because we need the workforce? How do we better deal with what now are workers that come under H-1B, which are high-tech or highly educated workers, and how do we encourage that group and make it easier for that group? How do we deal with H-1As, agricultural workers? So you could see a bill that's focused on that. You can see a bill that's focused on the asylum process. That was part of what was included in the bipartisan border bill that got tubed by former President Trump this spring, but improving the asylum process and the necessary staffing to handle all those asylum applicants so those cases can move much more quickly through the system. That could be another one. And then third, you need to really look at what additional resources, both from a technology and a manpower point are necessary to really achieve order at the
You
border.
touched on staffing, and that is a question that Carol asks, and we all know about this, about the shortage of immigration judges. You can be as effective as you want at the border, but if the courts, the immigration courts, can't match those paces, then you've already lost.
Yeah, I think we're probably short at least a couple thousand immigration judges. So even when you get resources to staff up in that area, it takes a while to hire people, train people, get them in place, et cetera. However, you can look at an asylum system that tries to deal with matters before they actually go to an immigration judge per se, like what can be handled by a border agent right at the border and properly so. And can decisions be made more quickly or on an expedited basis right at the border?
Douglas has a question about the effort to impeach Secretary Mayorkas, and therefore part of the significance of immigration in the election, but also the use of impeachment now as a tool for policy disagreements and for political manipulation rather than for high crimes and misdemeanors.
Yeah, have you ever seen anything more ridiculous than that? I mean, no crime, no misdemeanor alleged, nothing that Secretary Mayorkas has done remotely approach the level that the Constitution requires for impeachment. In essence, the Republican majority in the House just adopted a new impeachment standard. Doesn't require a high crime or misdemeanor. It requires a policy difference with the president, who's the cabinet secretary's boss. And if you can't get the president, which they haven't been able to do, well, we'll pick on one of his cabinet members. And I think the first time they brought that to the floor, they couldn't get it passed. So they had to wait for another Republican to show up. And so when he showed up, they finally had barely enough votes. I think it passed by 1 or 2 votes ultimately. Totally partisan. And then the Senate really had no choice but to just dismiss the whole thing. But the precedent it sets is something that should worry us all, because getting people into these slots, into these cabinet slots, particularly in departments like Homeland Security, which deal with a very difficult set of issues, is tough enough. You got to get them confirmed. That's tough enough. But then to have the threat of impeachment over them, at some point, you really deter really good qualified people from putting even their names in to do these jobs. And there are real systemic impacts for this kind of nonsense. And I hope that's not the case. I hope this was a one-off. But in my mind, I have some strong feelings about it. I know Secretary Mayorkas very well. I know what he's been dealing with. It was shameful.
There's a question from Jane about whether or not President Biden is in a position, either with the actual authority or whether it would even work politically, to issue executive orders to resolve problems at the border.
He can issue some, and he's issued quite a few during the course of his presidency. But the problem with doing that is that a president issues an executive order, the next president takes it away. It doesn't have the kind of permanence that people can rely on, that funding and staffing decisions can follow, et cetera, that having a law pass does. And quite frankly, we elect people to Congress, to the House, and to the Senate to do a job. And their job is to deal with the nation's problems and to pass laws to help resolve those problems. Unfortunately, right now, we're dealing with a Congress that was remarkably ineffective this past year. I think they passed fewer bills than even the so-called do-nothing Congress earlier in the 1900s. But again, I think you can use the executive authority to a degree, but an executive authority alone is not the answer.
Looking ahead to the presidential election later this year, you've been a governor of a state, you've occupied a national cabinet position, you've headed the UC system. So you've had a 360-degree vantage point on government and policy. What are your fears or concerns about a second Trump administration? And I would expect your hopes for a second Biden administration.
Yeah, I'll start with former President Trump. And I'll take as my starting place the interview he gave to Time Magazine a couple of weeks ago, what he would do in a second term. And I take him seriously. He's going to do what he said he wants to do. And so the entire civil service will be at risk of being replaced by political loyalists. He will only appoint people who are election deniers, meaning they deny the win that President Biden achieved in 2020. He will reverse all of President Biden's climate-oriented executive orders and the laws that were passed to help carry those out. He said very bluntly, drill, baby, drill. It's going to be more and more of actions of that sort. He'll not support the effort of Ukraine to beat back Russia and the Russian imperialism that's going on. And it will have, I believe, grievous impacts on our standing in the international world order. And that's important to the United States. It's important to those of us here at home. How America is viewed in the world has important domestic consequences. But it's not as transactional as I think President Trump likes to see it. So I think he'll undermine NATO, he'll undermine G7, the Five Eyes, all of our different international alliances will be at risk. I think we have a lot to worry about in a second Trump administration. And I would just simply say he's saying what he's going to do, and he has a term under his belt. He knows better how the levers of Washington, D.C. work, and he has people around him now who are loyalists or who know better how the levers of Washington work. So, it's going to be difficult. It would be very difficult. A second Biden administration, I think we'll see a continuation of the things he started. I think the full implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act. I think the full work that he's done on the climate arena, which is extraordinarily important for the long-term future of the United States and the world, quite frankly. I think we'll see restoration of balance in the federal courts as vacancies arise, and he can appoint people to those vacancies. I think a big difference would be how the whole justice system is treated between Trump and Biden. I think President Trump views the Justice Department as his personal lawyer and vengeance angel, and wants to treat it as such. And I think President Biden adheres to the historic and to date well-serving principle that the Justice Department is independent of the White House and makes its decisions independent of whoever is the president. So a big difference there.
We always like to end with something optimistic, and with what you've just said, I think you could segue nicely into your optimism and your hopes.
Well, my hope is for peace, peace in the Middle East, peace in Europe, peace in Africa and places like Darfur. My hope is that the United States remains the world's #1 country, which I believe we are, and a freedom-loving, complicated, but a freedom-loving and freedom-protecting country.
Secretary Janet Napolitano, it's been a pleasure. I hope you will join us again soon.
Thank you, Pat.
Thank you very much. I also want to thank everyone who's watching us, who's supporting us, and who follows these programs. As you see, on May 22nd, Neil Katyal, the Acting Solicitor General, former Acting Solicitor General, is joining Madeline Brand to talk about Trump, the courts, and the elections. By then, we may have a decision in the New York case, and we'll be coming up on the decision on presidential immunity from the Supreme Court, which we'll be dealing with, of course, as the weeks unfold. So look at our schedule, see what's coming up, and we do hope you'll join us. And I'm Pat Morrison, and I thank you for joining us.